If you believe storytelling is gaming's greatest strength, this one's for you. From overlooked cult classics to genre-defining giants, these are the games that made us think, question, cry, and sometimes just sit in silence when the credits rolled.
Have we met?
Before Mass Effect and Dragon Age, BioWare tried something bold. A martial arts RPG set in a world inspired by Chinese mythology. Jade Empire, released in 2005 for the original Xbox, was their attempt to blend fast-paced action with deep role-playing. And while it never hit the cultural heights of their later franchises, it's one of those games that feels like it deserves a second chance. What set Jade Empire apart was its setting. At a time when most RPGs were defaulting to medieval castles or futuristic space operas, this game embraced wuxia-style storytelling, complete with mystical monks, rival schools of martial arts, and morally gray choices about how to wield your growing power. The combat was real-time, more like an action game than the turn-based systems BioWare had been known for, and that shift made it stand out. Instead of queuing up commands, you were flipping between martial styles mid-fight, chaining combos, and using chi to enhance your moves. The story followed the familiar BioWare formula: good versus evil choices, romanceable companions, and a climactic twist, but its Eastern-inspired world gave it a flavor no other major RPG had at the time. It wasn't afraid to get weird with its mythology. Still, the game didn't land perfectly. The combat, while ambitious, felt shallow compared to true action games, and the morality system leaned a bit too hard on binary choices, which lacked the nuance BioWare later mastered. Critics praised the setting, but noted the game was shorter and less polished than KOTOR. And in the years that followed, it was largely overshadowed by BioWare's more successful projects. But in hindsight, this feels ahead of its time. It was one of the first big-budget attempts to step outside Western fantasy tropes and explore different cultural inspirations. For players who love BioWare's narrative-driven formula but want something truly different in flavor, Jade Empire is a forgotten gem waiting to be rediscovered. Telltale's The Walking Dead isn't about mowing down hordes of zombies. It's about the people you meet while the world falls apart. Playing as Lee Everett, you're tasked with protecting a young girl named Clementine, and the choices you make shape not only your story, but how those around you see you. The game's strength lies in its writing. Conversations feel natural, characters have layered personalities, and relationships change based on your actions. It's not about finding the right choice, it's about deciding what you can live with, knowing you'll have to face the consequences later. The gameplay is light on traditional mechanics, leaning heavily on dialogue choices and quick-time events. Some players might find it too passive, but the format works for the kind of story it wants to tell. Technical issues, like choppy performance on older platforms, can break immersion, but the emotional core stays strong. By the time the first season ends, you're not just playing for survival. You're making decisions for someone who's watching, learning, and growing. And that responsibility hits harder than any jump scare. Silent Hill 2 isn't about jump scares. It's about something slower, heavier, a dread that seeps in and lingers long after you stop playing. You step into the shoes of James Sunderland, who comes to the fog-choked town after receiving a letter from his wife, who's been dead for years. The story works because it's personal. The monsters aren't just random horrors. They're tied to James's guilt and the town's ability to manifest inner darkness. It's unsettling in ways that go beyond the usual horror beats, making you question the main character as much as the world around him. The PS2 era controls and clunky combat can feel rough now, and the camera occasionally fights you more than the enemies do. But here, those flaws almost work in the game's favor, amplifying the discomfort. The oppressive atmosphere, haunting soundtrack, and deliberate pacing make it feel more like a psychological descent than a standard survival horror game. Even decades later, few games match how Silent Hill 2 uses ambiguity and restraint. It doesn't explain everything. It leaves space for interpretation, and that's part of why it's still discussed, dissected, and remembered as one of the most impactful horror narratives in gaming.
And I use swords, but I much prefer healing.
Radiant Historia is one of those games that feels like it should have been a classic, but instead slipped quietly under the radar. It's a JRPG about war, destiny, and the ability to change the past. In a crowded market filled with remakes and bigger-name RPGs, it never got the recognition it deserved. Yet those who played it know it's one of the smartest and most heartfelt games of its era. You play as Stock, a soldier who gains the power of the White Chronicle, a book that lets him travel between alternate timelines. The setup sounds like a gimmick, but the game uses it in clever ways, branching paths, choices that ripple across timelines, and the ability to fix mistakes by returning to earlier moments. Unlike most RPGs where failure just means game over, Radiant Historia builds failure into its story, showing you the consequences of paths not taken. Combat is another highlight. It's turn-based, but with a grid system that lets you manipulate enemy positions, grouping them together for devastating combos or pushing them around to control the battlefield. It adds a tactical edge that keeps fights engaging without slowing them down. The story itself is surprisingly mature, tackling political intrigue, moral dilemmas, and the cost of war. It avoids the cliches that bog down so many RPGs from the era, instead focusing on its characters and the weight of their choices. The soundtrack only elevates the atmosphere, giving it both melancholy and hope in equal measure. Its biggest flaw isn't in the game itself, but in its reception. Released late in the DS's life and overshadowed by bigger franchises, Radiant Historia never broke out of niche status. Even a 3DS remake, while adding more content, didn't push it into the spotlight. But for RPG fans, this is a hidden gem, one that deserves to sit alongside the greats. Lost Odyssey takes the classic turn-based JRPG formula and weaves it into a story about immortality, memory, and the weight of time. You play as Kaim, a man who has lived for 1,000 years, yet remembers almost none of it, until fragments of his past start returning through dreamlike short stories. The combat is traditional but well-polished, blending magic, physical skills, and a timing-based ring system that adds a bit of engagement to each attack. It's not trying to reinvent the wheel, but it nails the fundamentals in a way that feels deliberate and confident. What really sets it apart are the 1,000 Years of Dreams segments, text-based vignettes that read like intimate short stories, exploring moments of love, loss, and the quiet tragedies that come with living too long. These sections slow the game down, but they give it an emotional weight most RPGs never reach. Pacing can be uneven, and load times in the original release were notoriously long, but the payoff is a heartfelt, reflective adventure that feels like the spiritual successor to the golden era of JRPGs. For players willing to take their time, it's one of the genre's hidden treasures. Oxenfree feels like a ghost story whispered around a campfire, but one you get to shape with every choice. It follows a group of teenagers who sneak onto a mysterious island for a night of fun, only to stumble into a supernatural rift that connects them with voices from another dimension. It's not about action or combat. In fact, you'll never throw a punch. Instead, it's about dialogue, relationships, and the way the past bleeds into the present. The heart of this game lies in its conversation system. Unlike most games where dialogue pauses the action, here conversations flow naturally, overlapping with movement and exploration. You can interrupt, stay silent, or steer discussions in different directions, and the characters respond as though they're real people caught in a terrifying situation. It feels more like listening to a great indie film than playing a traditional adventure game. Visually, the game is understated, with a painterly art style that captures the loneliness of the island. And then there's the radio mechanic, tuning frequencies to pick up eerie signals and ghostly voices. It's such a simple idea, but it builds an atmosphere that sticks with you long after the credits roll. Of course, not everything lands perfectly. The pacing can feel slow at times, especially if you're expecting big set pieces, and some players felt the ending was a little too ambiguous. But those flaws are also part of what makes it special. Oxenfree isn't trying to be a blockbuster. It's a quiet, unsettling narrative that asks you to pay attention, to connect with its characters, and to piece together a mystery that's as much about growing up as it is about the supernatural. It may not have made the sales charts, but Oxenfree carved out a devoted fanbase. Its sequel shows the lasting appeal of this kind of storytelling. For anyone who's ever wanted a game that feels like flipping through a weird, haunting indie comic, this is worth every second.
The whole night.
Yes, keeping in mind who you're tired of.
Puppets, such as yourself.
Set in 14th century France during the Black Death, A Plague Tale: Innocence is less about historical accuracy and more about human connection under impossible circumstances. You play as Amicia, a young noble forced to protect her sickly younger brother Hugo as the Inquisition hunts them and plague-ridden rats swarm the land. The gameplay leans on stealth and puzzle-solving rather than combat. You're not a warrior, you're a survivor, making every escape feel tense. The rat swarms are a standout mechanic. Moving like a living tide, you have to manipulate with light and fire. It's simple in concept, but creates some unforgettable set pieces. The story is carried by Amicia and Hugo's evolving relationship. Early resentment gives way to genuine care, and their small victories feel meaningful in a world that offers them little hope. Still, the dialogue can be uneven at times, and stealth encounters sometimes feel more trial and error than strategic. Visually, it punches above its weight for a mid-budget title, with striking lighting and atmospheric environments. By the end, it's not the rats or the plague that stick with you. It's the bond between two siblings who never ask for heroism, but find it anyway.
Here's the rest of them.
In greeting. If an assault.
Disco Elysium is unlike anything else in gaming. Released in 2019, it throws away traditional combat systems and replaces them with conversation, inner monologues, and the kind of political and philosophical debates you'd expect from a dense novel. You play as a washed-up detective who wakes up after a catastrophic bender, unsure of who he is or what he believes in, tasked with solving a murder in the decaying city of Revachol. But the real story isn't just about solving the case. It's about piecing together your fractured identity. What makes this game so powerful is how it treats choice. Every dialogue option matters. Every skill you invest in shapes not just your detective's abilities, but his worldview. Your stats don't just determine combat. They're voices in your head, arguing with you, influencing your decisions, sometimes sabotaging them. It's messy, unpredictable, and deeply human. Yet for all its brilliance, Disco Elysium can be daunting. Its walls of text and slow pacing turn away players looking for action-heavy gameplay. Some found it too political, too heavy-handed in its critiques of ideology and society. But that's also the point. It's unapologetically cerebral, demanding your patience and attention. Despite being overlooked by many, those who stuck with it found one of the richest role-playing experiences ever created. It's a game that proves storytelling in gaming doesn't always need explosions or cut scenes. It can be driven by dialogue, thought, and the haunting question of who you really are. When Final Fantasy VII landed in 1997, it didn't just launch a new chapter for the series. It changed what people thought a video game story could be. Cloud's journey from detached mercenary to reluctant hero plays out against a world struggling under corporate greed, environmental collapse, and an enemy who's as personal as he is cosmic. The Midgar opening remains one of the strongest in RPG history, dropping you straight into a rebellion with no slow onboarding. From there, the story widens into something far more complex, balancing large-scale stakes with intimate character arcs. Aerith, Tifa, Barrett, and the rest aren't just sidekicks. They have their own motivations, flaws, and growth. Of course, not every part has aged perfectly. The translation is clumsy in places, pacing dips in the middle act, and the blocky character models can be a shock to new players. But the writing and atmosphere still carry it, and the score remains unforgettable. The remake reimagines the early part of the story with modern visuals and expanded scenes, but the original's raw charm is hard to replicate. For all its imperfections, Final Fantasy VII blends emotion, spectacle, and ambition in a way that made it a cultural touchstone, and it's still worth experiencing in its original form. Vinba is one of those rare games that tells a story you almost never see in the industry. Released in 2023, It's a short narrative-driven experience about an Indian immigrant family living in Canada, and it uses food, not dialogue, not flashy mechanics, as the main tool for storytelling. On the surface, you're just cooking dishes following recipes and mixing spices. But every meal carries weight, each one tied to moments of joy, struggle, and identity. You play as a mother, trying to hold her family together while balancing the challenges of raising a child in a culture that doesn't always understand her. The game shows how traditions get passed down or lost between generations. Cooking becomes more than sustenance. It's a way of keeping memories alive, of reminding your family where they came from even as they adapt to a new home. It's subtle, but that's what makes it powerful. From a gameplay perspective, it's incredibly simple. It's more like solving little puzzles than running a kitchen, and the whole game can be finished in under 2 hours. Some might see that brevity as a weakness, and others may wish it had more layers of interactivity. But the point isn't to test your skills, it's to make you feel, to immerse you of a lived experience. The art style, with its warm palettes and storybook-like charm, enhances that intimacy. And the soundtrack, blending traditional Indian influences with contemporary sounds, ties it all together. What it lacks in size, it makes up for in resonance. Vinbot didn't arrive with blockbuster fanfare, but it sparked important conversations about representation and the kinds of stories games can tell. For players tired of endless sequels and formulaic AAA narratives, it's proof that small, personal stories can hit just as hard, sometimes harder, than any sprawling epic. Cooking a meal isn't just about following steps. It's about passing down love, even when words aren't enough. Nier Automata looks like a stylish action game at first glance. Fast combat, flashy moves, and a cast of sleek android protagonists. But beneath the surface, it's a deeply layered story about identity, purpose, and what it means to exist at all. Playing as 2B, 9S, and later A2, you uncover truths about the war between androids and machines that shift your understanding of everything you've been told. The gameplay blends Platinum Games' fluid combat with light RPG elements, platforming, and even genre shifts, at times turning into a bullet hell shooter or text adventure without warning. This variety keeps it fresh, even if some side quests can feel like padding. What makes it special is how it uses multiple playthroughs to reveal its full story. The first run gives you one perspective, the second reframes it entirely, and by the final endings, you realize the game's been leading you towards something far more emotional and human than you expected. It's not perfect. The open world is sparse in places, and the combat, while satisfying, isn't as deep as other Platinum titles. But Nier Automata is the kind of game that lingers in your head, not because of its mechanics, but because it makes you feel something rare, hope in the middle of hopelessness. Wildermyth is one of those games that sneaks up on you. At first glance, its paper cutout art style looks almost too simple, like something you'd expect from a small Flash game. But then you start playing and you realize it's quietly one of the most ambitious storytelling systems in modern gaming. Released in 2021, it's a tactical RPG where the real magic isn't in the combat. It's in the stories that emerge around your characters. The premise is straightforward. You guide a band of adventurers through battles and choices, shaping their destinies as they fight monsters and uncover myths. But what makes it stand out is how much of the story is generated dynamically. Characters age, fall in love, feud, retire, or even die, and the game adapts, weaving those outcomes into a personal mythology. No two playthroughs are ever the same, and that unpredictability makes it feel alive in a way scripted RPGs can't replicate. The combat itself borrows from familiar grid-based tactics, but the highlight is how abilities tie into the environment. A mage doesn't just cast spells. They interfuse with objects in the battlefield, hurling flames from a campfire or splintering wood from a tree. It keeps battles fresh and creative. Of course, being so systems-driven has its downsides. The procedural storytelling, while impressive, sometimes stumbles into awkward phrasing or tonal shifts that break the immersion. And while the art has a unique charm, it won't be to everyone's taste, especially players who prefer more polished visuals. Yet those quirks are easy to forgive when the game constantly surprises you with small, human moments. Wilder Myth didn't dominate headlines, but for those who played it, it became something special, a reminder that storytelling in games doesn't always need to be pre-written. Sometimes, the best stories are the ones you accidentally create along the way. Mass Effect 2 took everything good about the first game and stripped away most of the clunk. The result was a sharper, more focused RPG shooter hybrid built entirely around one goal: getting your team ready for a mission that might kill them all. The genius is in the structure. You spend most of the game recruiting characters and earning their loyalty through personal quests, each one revealing layers you didn't expect. From hardened mercenaries to mysterious scientists, no one feels like filler, and their survival in the finale depends on how well you've understood and supported them. The combat is tighter, the controls more responsive, and the pacing smoother than its predecessor. Still, it's not flawless. The RPG elements are lighter than some fans wanted, and the resource mining minigame can feel like busy work. But as a character-driven narrative, it's hard to beat. The final suicide mission changes depending on your choices and preparations, making the climax feel uniquely yours. It's a rare sequel that not only improves on the original, but also stands tall as one of the most memorable sci-fi stories in gaming.
Actually, yes. I owe big...
When Life is Strange first released, it immediately stood out. Not because of its graphics or mechanics, but because it told a small, personal story in a genre dominated by spectacle. At its heart, it's about a photography student who discovers she has the power to rewind time. That setup sounds like sci-fi, but the game never loses sight of its real focus: the friendships, heartbreak, and choices that shape who we are. The story unfolds in the fictional town of Arcadia Bay, where Max reconnects with her childhood friend Chloe. The two get tangled in a mystery involving a missing girl, buried secrets, and an approaching storm that threatens to destroy the town. What makes the game so compelling isn't just the supernatural hook, it's how grounded everything feels. Conversations are awkward and messy, the choices never easy, and the consequences often painful. Of course, the game has its flaws, and they're worth acknowledging. The dialogue has been criticized for feeling forced or cringe, especially with some of the slang. The lip-syncing and animations often looked stiff even at launch, making it feel dated compared to other 2015 releases. But despite those rough edges, the emotional weight of its story pushed through. For many players, the relationship between Max and Chloe became one of the most memorable dynamics in gaming. Messy and imperfect in all the ways real relationships often are. The rewind mechanic was simple but effective, letting you play out what-if scenarios without ever being able to fully escape the consequences. It gave choice-driven storytelling a unique twist. You could fix small mistakes, but the bigger decisions always came back to haunt you. That balance between control and inevitability gave the narrative a bittersweet tension. Life is Strange remains a reminder that sometimes the stories that stick with us are the ones that feel the most human.
Max.
The 2018 reboot of God of War didn't just change the series setting, it reshaped its identity. Trading the over-the-top chaos of Greek mythology for the colder, more restrained world of Norse legends. It follows Kratos as he travels with his son Atreus to fulfill his late wife's final wish. The combat is still heavy and satisfying, with the Leviathan axe quickly becoming one of the most iconic weapons in gaming. But what stands out most is how the action serves the story. Every fight, puzzle, and quiet boat ride deepens the bond and tension between father and son. Kratos, once defined by rage, is now a man wrestling with how to teach strength without passing on his own flaws. The single-shot camera design pulls you closer to the journey, but it also means the pacing can feel tight in some spots and padded in others. Side content varies in quality. Some favors and collectibles feel like filler. Yet the best optional quests rival the main story in depth and payoff. It's a rare reboot that respects its roots while confidently becoming something new, proving that a blockbuster action game can deliver just as much emotional weight as spectacle. To the Moon doesn't look like much at first glance. Released in 2011 by Freebird Games, it uses a pixel art style that feels closer to a 16-bit RPG than anything modern. There are no big battles, no elaborate mechanics. Just a simple framework for telling one of the most emotional stories ever put into a game. And that's exactly why it stuck with so many players. The premise is quietly devastating. You play as two doctors who grant dying patients a final wish by implanting memories into their minds. Their latest client, Johnny, wants to go to the moon, though he can't explain why. To fulfill his wish, you dive into his memories, rewinding through his life to uncover the pieces of his past and the reasons behind his longing. The more you see, the more the request transforms from something whimsical into something deeply human and heartbreaking. What makes To the Moon remarkable is how much it does with so little. The pixel visuals are modest, but the writing and pacing carry enormous weight. Every revelation feels intimate, every memory stitched together with care. And then there's the music. King Gao's soundtrack has become iconic, with tracks like For River perfectly capturing the melancholy beauty of the story. It's not flawless. Some players felt the dialogue could get heavy-handed, and because there's so little gameplay, others dismissed it as more of a visual novel than a proper RPG. But that simplicity is part of its charm. It focuses entirely on its narrative and emotional resonance, cutting away everything else that might dilute the experience. Looking back, To the Moon was one of the early titles that showed indie games didn't need big budgets to leave a mark. It became a cult classic, praised for making players cry in ways most blockbusters couldn't. For anyone who doubts that games can be powerful storytelling devices, this short, unassuming journey to the stars is a reminder that sometimes the smallest steps leave the deepest footprints.
False shepherd.
And you the lamb.
Let's not call each other.
At first glance, BioShock Infinite feels like a dream. A floating city bathed in sunlight, barbershop quartets on the corner, and patriotic banners on every street. But it doesn't take long for that postcard image to twist. You play as Booker DeWitt, sent to Columbia to find a girl named Elizabeth. And the deeper you go, the more you see the city's idyllic facade give way to fanaticism, oppression, and something even stranger lurking underneath. The relationship between Booker and Elizabeth is the emotional core. Elizabeth isn't just an escort mission. She's active, helpful, and central to the story's biggest reveals. Their growing connection gives the narrative a human anchor, even as it veers into mind-bending territory about parallel worlds and cause and effect. Gunplay is fast and flashy, with vigors adding variety to the standard shooting, but the combat arenas can feel repetitive over time. The pacing is also a point of debate. The middle section drags in spots, and some plot turns come so quickly they're hard to absorb on a first playthrough. Flaws aside, few games swing for the fences the way Infinite does. Its ending is divisive, but it cements the story as one that isn't afraid to take risks. And whether you love it or not, it's hard to forget. When most people think of Borderlands, they think of chaotic looter-shooter gameplay, outrageous guns, and a non-stop stream of jokes that sometimes land and sometimes don't. What they don't usually think of is great storytelling. That's why Tales from the Borderlands caught so many people off guard when it dropped in 2014. Instead of leaning into the franchise's trademark mayhem, Telltale Games delivered a narrative-driven adventure that turned the noisy, bombastic Borderlands universe into a stage for some of the funniest and surprisingly heartfelt storytelling of the decade. You play as Reese, a corporate ladder climber, and Fiona, a con artist, two characters who couldn't be more different but get tangled together in a wild hunt for a vault. On the surface, it's classic Telltale. Dialogue choices, branching paths, and QTs driving the action. But what makes it shine is the writing. The banter between Reese and Fiona, the absurd situations they stumble into, and the side characters make it feel less like a spin-off and more like a standalone comedy drama. Yet, underneath the humor, there's real heart. The game takes time to explore themes of trust, greed, and loyalty, showing that even in a world as unhinged as Pandora, relationships matter. And while other Telltale games sometimes stumbled with pacing or forced drama, here it's a rare balance. Funny without being throwaway, emotional without being melodramatic. Of course, it wasn't perfect. The QTE-heavy gameplay won't appeal to everyone, and if you weren't already on board with Telltale's formula, nothing here would change your mind. Plus, its tie-in nature probably made some players dismiss it as just a side story. But those who gave it a chance discovered something special, a Borderlands experience that didn't need constant gunfire to be engaging. Some games are called timeless because of nostalgia. Chrono Trigger earns it. Released in 1995, it blended a sharp, fast-paced RPG system with one of the most cleverly structured stories of its era. A time travel adventure where actions in one era ripple across centuries. The game wastes no time pulling you in. Within the first hour, you're hopping between the past and future, meeting characters whose arcs pay off in ways that still feel satisfying today. The cast, from the silent protagonist Chrono to the brooding frog and the quirky robot Robo, is memorable not just because of their personalities, but because the game gives each of them moments to matter. Combat is classic turn-based, but with a twist. Characters can combine their abilities for dual tech and triple tech attacks, which keeps battles lively. It's snappy, with no random encounter grind slowing you down, and the pacing makes it easy to stay hooked. That said, it's not flawless. Some side quests feel thin compared to the main story, and if you played it multiple times, the early hours can feel overly familiar. But its multiple endings, clever use of time travel, and tight runtime make it one of the few RPGs that feels just as fresh on a replay. Nearly 30 years later, Chrono Trigger still shows how to tell a sweeping, emotional story without wasting a single scene, something even modern games struggle to match. Citizen Sleeper isn't the kind of game that screams for attention. It's a small, text-heavy RPG set on a rundown space station called Erland's Eye. You play as a sleeper, a human mind transferred into a synthetic body owned by a megacorp, now on the run and trying to carve out a fragile existence in the cracks of a decaying capitalist future. There are no epic battles, no sweeping cinematics, just quiet choices, dice rolls, and the constant tension of survival. What makes it special is how it captures the feeling of living on edge. Every day, you wake up with a limited set of dice that determine your actions, working shifts, scavenging, making connections, or just scraping together enough food and medicine to keep going. It's a simple system, but it creates this overwhelming sense of fragility. Every decision feels like it could tip the balance between survival and collapse. The storytelling is where it shines. Through conversations and branching storylines, you meet people struggling with their own survival. Hackers, refugees, mercenaries, families trying to hold things together. It's less about saving the world and more about helping or failing to help the people around you. And that smaller scale makes its themes of identity, belonging, and freedom hit harder than most galaxy-spanning space operas. That said, it isn't for everyone. Its heavy reliance on text and its slow, methodical pacing can feel more like reading a novel than playing a traditional RPG. Some might find the randomness of dice rolls frustrating, especially when bad luck blocks progress in a story arc. But those very quirks give it character. It's a game about uncertainty, and the systems reflect that. It didn't sell millions, and it never dominated headlines. But Citizen Sleeper has quietly built a dedicated following. For players who love games that blur the line between literature and interactivity, it's proof that powerful storytelling doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to feel real.
Okay, time to work.
Heavy Rain is built on one question. How far would you go to save someone you love? Told through 4 playable characters connected by the hunt for the origami killer. It's a branching, interactive drama where your decisions can change or abruptly end the story. Its biggest strength is tension. Scenes often play out like a chain of small but stressful moments. Holding your breath during a break-in, fumbling through a high-stakes chase, or deciding whether to cross a moral line. Failures aren't just game over screens. They push the narrative in unexpected directions, and the game never stops to reset your mistakes. Not everything lands perfectly. The voice acting is uneven, some dialogue feels awkward, and the infamous Press X to Jason meme shows how easily a serious moment can slip into unintentional comedy. But when the story hits its stride, the mix of mystery, urgency, and emotional stakes works. It's not flawless, but Heavy Rain was an early example of choice-driven storytelling in games that treated consequences as permanent, and it paved the way for many narrative titles that came after.
Jimmy Brooks.
Me?
Red Dead Redemption 2 is less about checking off objectives and more about inhabiting a place and time. Set in the fading days of the Wild West, it follows Arthur Morgan as he wrestles with loyalty to his gang and the creeping realization that the world is moving on without them. The detail is staggering, from weather that changes how your horse moves to townsfolk who remember how you treated them. That immersion makes even mundane moments, like riding through the countryside at sunrise, feel cinematic. But that same commitment to realism is also what turns some players off. Movement can feel heavy, animations are deliberate, and the pace demands patience. Story-wise, it's one of Rockstar's most human narratives. Arthur isn't a one-note outlaw. He's layered, conflicted, and capable of real growth depending on your choices. The supporting cast feels equally fleshed out, making later story beats hit harder because you've spent so much quiet time with them. It's not a game for rushing. If you go in expecting constant action, the slow build might frustrate you. But if you let it breathe, RDR2 delivers one of the richest, most affecting worlds gaming has seen, and an ending that lingers long after the credits roll. Before Persona 3, the series was niche. This was the game that pushed it into the spotlight, blending everyday school life with supernatural battles against shadow creatures. By day, you manage classes, friendships, and part-time jobs. By night, you climb Tartarus, a massive, otherworldly tower that appears during the hidden dark hour. The hook isn't just the stylish combat or the time management system. It's how those two have feed into each other. The relationships you build during the day directly strengthen you in battle, making your choices feel meaningful. And while the social sim side is colorful and often lighthearted, the main story is anything but. Themes of mortality and the inevitability of loss run throughout, giving the ending a real emotional punch. Still, it's a game of its time. Tartarus is repetitive, with randomly generated floors that can blur together, and the AI-controlled teammates in the original version can be frustrating. Later releases, like Persona 3 Portable and the upcoming Reload remake, improve on these issues, but the original still has a certain atmosphere that's hard to replicate. It's not flawless, but proved that a JRPG could blend slice-of-life charm with heavy, thought-provoking storytelling. And that formula would go on to define the series' global success.
I've remembered something.
Back in 1999, most RPGs focused on swords, spells, and loot. Planescape Torment had those things, but it cared far more about what you said than what you swung. Playing as the Nameless One, an immortal with no memory of his past, you explore the bizarre, shifting city of Sigil, a place where demons, gods, and mortals mingle, and where even a passing conversation can change the course of your journey. The writing is dense, but purposeful. Every line feels like it's building the world or revealing something about your character. The choices you make aren't about good or evil in the typical RPG sense. They're about shaping an identity, piecing together who you've been, and deciding who you'll be now. Its biggest strength, the writing, is also its biggest barrier. There's a lot of text, and if you're not ready to sink into it, you might bounce off. Combat exists, but it's secondary and clunky compared to modern standards. The pacing can feel slow, especially early on. Yet even with those rough edges, no other game has captured its particular mix of philosophy, melancholy, and weird beauty. It's not just about what happens, it's about the ideas it leaves you with. And that's why it's still discussed over 2 decades later.
I do. But we're good.
Uncharted 4 closes Nathan Drake's story with a mix of high-stakes treasure hunting and quiet reflection. Years after leaving his dangerous life behind, Nate is pulled back in by the sudden return of his long-lost brother Sam, leading to one last globe-trotting search for pirate treasure. The set pieces are as spectacular as ever. Collapsing towers, high-speed chases, and a now-famous Jeep sequence that blurs the line between cutscene and gameplay. But what makes this entry stand out is its slower, more personal side. Conversations with Elena, doubts about Sam's motives, and the weight of Nate's past choices give the game an emotional depth the earlier entries only hinted at. That slower pace won't be for everyone. Some stretches favor climbing and dialogue over constant action, which might test players looking for pure adrenaline. Still, it's this balance that makes the big moments hit harder. You feel the years Nate has spent chasing danger, and you understand why he might finally want to stop. As a send-off, it's satisfying without feeling like fan service. It respects the character's history while letting him walk away on his own terms, leaving the series with both a bang and a sense of closure.
1,000 deaths. A soldier dies but one.
Some open-world games give you space, but little reason to care about it. The Witcher 3 fills every corner with stories worth finding. Playing as Geralt, you're not chasing generic fetch quests. You're tracking missing people, untangling local feuds, and dealing with choices that rarely have a clean good or bad answer. The main plot of searching for Ciri while navigating political chaos and the looming threat of the Wild Hunt is strong on its own, but it's the side quests that truly define the game. From the tragic Bloody Baron arc to smaller village mysteries, the Pan quest, the writing treats even throwaway missions with care. Combat is functional rather than flashy, and while it improves with skill upgrades and potion prep, it's not the main draw. Exploration, dialogue, and decision-making carry the experience, helped by a world that feels lived in. Peasants muttering as you pass, merchants adjusting prices based on how you've treated them. It's not perfect. The inventory can be a chore, the character navigation and combat can be weird. Controlling Roach is a gamble, and the sheer volume of content can be overwhelming. But when a game can make you remember the fate of a minor NPC as clearly as the ending itself, you know it's doing something special.
Wake up, Master. Please.
Detroit Become Human puts you in control of 3 android protagonists, Connor, Kara, and Marcus, each navigating their own path in a near future where artificial intelligence is on the verge of rebellion. It's an interactive drama where your decisions shape the story in big and small ways, branching into dozens of possible outcomes. The game's biggest strength is how those choices feel immediate. Fail a quick-time event, and a character can die. The story doesn't reset to save them. Each lead offers a different perspective. Connor's detective work mixes tension and investigation. Kara's journey is personal and human, and Marcus's arc tackles the larger political fight for android rights. Not all writing lands equally well. Some moments lean heavy on cliches, and certain metaphors for real-world oppression lack subtlety. But when it works, it works. Small, quiet scenes can hit just as hard as the high-stakes set pieces. Visually, it's one of the most polished narrative games of its kind, with impressive motion capture and detail. And thanks to the branching design, it has strong replay value, encouraging you to see how wildly different your story could have turned out.
Unity to mean something.
When The Last of Us launched in 2013, it proved that a game about survival could be just as much about people as it is about danger. Joel and Ellie's cross-country journey through a ruined America isn't just a road trip. It's a slow build of trust, conflict, and unspoken care in a world where kindness is a liability. The storytelling works because it's grounded. The infected are a constant threat, but the real tension often comes from human encounters. Desperate survivors, brutal raiders, and those trying to cling to some form of order. The dialogue feels lived in, and the quieter moments between the two leads hit just as hard as the big action beats. Gameplay-wise, it's not revolutionary. Stealth, scavenging, and crafting are familiar systems, but they're tightly tuned to feed the atmosphere. Every bullet matters. Every choice to engage or avoid a fight has weight. Some criticize it for being too linear or for leaning heavily on scripted sequences, but that's also what gives it its cinematic rhythm. It knows when to slow down and when to hit you hard. The ending, still debated to this day, refuses to give easy answers, which is exactly why it sticks.
How many of you are there?